From a psychological standpoint, Elena's story begins long before she leaves the ballroom. It begins in the methodical erosion of identity, the kind narcissistic abusers perfect over years: isolation, financial dependency, public humiliation, and emotional conditioning disguised as marriage. By the time she meets Dominic, Elena is not simply heartbroken, she is neurologically trapped in a cycle of fear and attachment. That is what makes this encounter so dangerous and so fascinating. Because Dominic immediately recognizes Marcus for what he is, a control addict losing possession of his subject, and when men like that feel ownership slipping, they escalate. The real question is not whether Elena can escape Marcus. The real question is how much blood, obsession, and psychological damage will surface before he lets her go.
Subject 1. Elena Martinez initiates a disengagement protocol from the social gathering, an act synchronized with the onset of precipitation. The percussive sound of her footwear on marble serves as an externalization of her internal psychological revolt. Retrograde motion is psychically untenable following the perpetrator's calculated verbal assault. Psychologically dismantled on the anniversary of her spouse's birth, she is absorbed by the deluge, oblivious to his true sociopathic classification as a criminal syndicate leader. Her attire, an emerald gown representing a significant financial investment in his public facade, now bears the markings of the event. An element of his portfolio, a fixture of his brand, an asset to all observers except for the subject herself. During her egress from Chicago's Grand Meridian, the November gale is perceived as a physical assault, yet it is insignificant compared to the intrapsychic violation she experienced. Physical trauma indicators are absent. The abuser, Marcus, specializes in inflicting non-corporeal injuries. His method of psychological degradation is clinical and precise. The subject consequently exhibits dissociative ambulation, clutching a personal belonging for grounding as her respiration becomes erratic. The city's indifferent architecture serves as impassive observers, while precipitation obscures her lacrimal response. Inside, 200 guests celebrate Marcus Whitfield's 40th year. The financial allocation for the event's decor exceeded her annual income as a pediatric nurse, illustrating a severe power imbalance. It was a staged theater of opulence featuring a jazz trio performing to an indifferent audience. At its center stood Marcus, the architect of his narcissistic kingdom. Elena performed her designated role, the required smile inducing somatic discomfort in her jaw. She simulated amusement in response to his associates' crude humor, projecting a facade of tranquility that had long since been extinguished. This emotional labor has defined her 8-year marital arrangement. A single, uninterrupted performance. Tonight, however, the psychological construct finally fractured, triggered by Marcus boasting to investors about a new acquisition. An associate gestured towards the perpetrator's expansive holdings and then to his family unit. Marcus emitted a vocalization the subject found aversive, both cold and sharp. "Beautiful," he broadcasted publicly. "Let us maintain realism, gentlemen. Elena is functional. Hyperbole is not required. I retain her for her practical utility. She comprehends the value of silence and, for the most part, refrains from causing public disgrace." A palpable tension permeated the investors. A throat was cleared, but no intervention occurred. A classic bystander effect. The subject entered a freeze response, her wine glass exhibiting tremors. She was at a psychological breaking point. She experienced intrusive ideations of retaliation, a fantasy of unmasking his covert pathology. She recalled his patterns of coercive control, constant verbal degradation, and the systematic erosion of her spirit. Instead, she executed one last conditioned performance, a rehearsed smile, and a tactical withdrawal to the restroom. From this location, she proceeded directly out the main entrance. She is now on Michigan Avenue, a space previously encoded with positive memories, now a stage for her debasement. The shop windows are dark, displaying mannequins in static poses of manufactured contentment. The subject ceases ambulation, confronting the reality of her displacement. The domestic space is not a sanctuary, but a gilded cell, a construct of Marcus's control. It is the locus where she anticipates his punitive rage, which she expects will dissect her act of insubordination. She is in a state of complete social isolation, a condition methodically engineered by Marcus. He systematically severed her connections to family and friends. Her parents are deceased. Her sister, estranged for 3 years, fled to Seattle after Marcus intercepted a communication and fabricated the end of Elena's affection. This isolation presents as a somatic sensation, a crushing physical weight. Her ambulation continues with a notable disregard for her high-value footwear or the cosmetic disarray on her face. Her primary drive is to create distance. After 3 blocks, she navigates to a secondary street. She is searching for a moment of psychological reprieve when she locates it. A small cafe, its illumination a beacon in the darkness. The establishment is signed Nocturne. Elena enters, a small bell signaling her transition into a calm, quiet environment. The setting is an idealized sanctuary with dark wood, soft jazz, and an atmosphere of deliberate solitude. The establishment's emptiness reflects Elena's own internal landscape as she seeks refuge in a corner, consciously choosing to become unseen. She selects the most remote booth, a space where she might achieve a temporary state of ego dissolution. A server named Sophie, a source of compassion, penetrates this self-imposed exile. Rough night? The simple inquiry is a social offering. Elena looks up. She registers profound surprise at the simple decency of being acknowledged. Is it that obvious? The server offers a benign smile. Your mascara provides a clear narrative. May I bring you something? It is complimentary. Water is sufficient, thank you. And perhaps some napkins. Sophie returns with water and an ample supply. She also provides an unsolicited plate of biscotti, for which the subject is deeply grateful. Remain as long as you need, Sophie offers. We are open until 2. For the next hour, Elena remains still, attempting to reintegrate her fractured psyche while watching the rain create patterns on the glass. She initiates a cognitive review of the decisions that led to her present state. Marrying Marcus at 24. He was charismatic, affluent, and significantly older. He had cast her as a protagonist in a grand narrative, effectively blinding her to the pathological warning signs. The intense jealousy he disguised as affection, the total control he framed as protection, the overt cruelty he rationalized as mere honesty. She was entrapped before she could perceive the cage. Her financial assets were absorbed. Her support structure was dismantled. Her sense of self was methodically deconstructed by years of his psychological warfare. But in the cafe's quietude, a profound internal shift begins. An emotion she has not experienced for years surfaces. This is not the familiar, chronic anger of learned helplessness. This was a focused, potent blade of pure rage, the kind that fuels a paradigm shift. She is 32 years old, holding a nursing degree unused for 3 years because Marcus deemed it beneath her status. She has 0 assets, nothing, only her current attire and a covert emergency fund she has been building for 6 months. $3,000 concealed in an account unknown to him. It is objectively insufficient, but it constitutes a beginning. Absorbed in her planning, she does not perceive the man from the bar approaching until he speaks. Pardon me. She flinches, a hyper-vigilant response. He is tall, perhaps 6'2", his dark hair damp from the rain. His eyes are the color of an approaching storm, and he possesses a presence that dominates the space without effort. His charcoal suit is of immense value, yet it is worn with an absence of pretense. This man does not simply possess wealth, he embodies it. I apologize for the intrusion, he states, his voice low and stable. I observed you enter and you appeared to be in distress. I only wished to confirm your safety. Elena's psychological defenses activate instantly. Her capacity for male interaction is depleted, yet his tone makes her pause. It contains no predatory undertones, no trace of a social gambit. It presents as genuine concern. I'm fine, she replies automatically, the lie creating cognitive dissonance. He simply raises an eyebrow, accepting her response without challenge. Very well, he says. If you require anything, I will be at the bar. My name is Dominic. As he turns to leave, a conditioned impulse urges her to allow his departure. But a new, emergent voice compels her to speak. Wait. Dominic halts and faces her. Why? She asks, demanding his motivation. Why would you be concerned for a stranger's well-being? He considers for a moment before replying. Because sometimes, he begins, articulating his words with care. The only factor that allows a person to endure a traumatic night is to have another human being witness their pain. His statement strikes her with incredible force, resonating with the many nights she felt invisible, her internal screams for help going unanswered. Sit, she says, her voice a near whisper. Please. Dominic occupies the opposite seat with a fluid, confident grace. At this proximity, she can observe he is in his late 30s, with fine lines around his eyes, suggesting his own history of difficult nights. I am Elena, she offers. A pleasure, Elena. I only wish the circumstances were more favorable. A dry, brief laugh escapes her. That feeling is mutual. A moment of comfortable silence passes between them. There is no perceived need for immediate explanation. Dominic provides a patient, grounding silence. At last, Elena breaks it. I just exited my husband's birthday party. You've left him? He was not lacking for company. He had 200 of his closest associates to provide support. The bitterness in her own voice surprises her. Besides, I doubt he has even registered my absence. He is too occupied with being the center of his universe. Dominic offers a slow, thoughtful nod. That sounds like a difficult position for you. That is a significant understatement. So how would you characterize it? Elena considers for a moment. A mistake, she says finally, a very long, very costly mistake. He offers no pity, no solutions. He simply listens, actively listens, in a manner Marcus never did. The most difficult part, Elena continues, the words beginning to flow, is that I knew, on some subconscious level. I knew from the start something was dissonant, but I ignored the data. I told myself I was irrational, that all relationships are laborious, that marriage itself would modify him. A harsh, empty laugh tore from her. Oh, he was modified, certainly. The process only refined his cruelty. People reveal their fundamental nature, Dominic stated, his voice quiet. The mistake is not in believing them initially, it's in repeatedly ignoring that same evidence. Elena observed him then, truly perceiving him. His slate-gray eyes were voids containing a history she could not decipher. This individual was far from naive, his immaculate clothing notwithstanding. That sounds like a lesson acquired through hardship, she remarked. Dominic gave a slight shrug. We all have a past. The only relevant question is whether you permit it to define your future self. In that instant, a silent understanding formed between them as they spoke of matters both immense and trivial. Subject Elena inferred Dominic's Chicago enterprise was significant, a detail he intentionally obfuscated. His self-disclosure, a sister overseas, a mother deceased 5 years prior, a failed engagement, were calculated releases of information. His rationale for this separation was stark. She determined my world was incompatible with her survival. Objectively, he continued, her assessment was correct. His vocal tone betrayed a residual psychological trauma, an injury that had cicatrized but not fully healed. This was a familiar state for Elena, who exhibited analogous psychic scarring. In this shared stillness, time perception became distorted. The storm, patrons, and their server, Sophie, became peripheral as they mechanically consumed unsolicited sustenance. By 0100 hours, Elena experienced a resurgence of self-concept, an affective state dormant for years. A notable catharsis resulted from recounting her history to a neutral party, an observer with no prior context. With Dominic, she perceived a space free of social judgment, permitting total emotional disinhibition. My departure seems indicated. She finally articulated, her words marked by hesitation. Destination? Dominic's query was brief, yet its implication of her displacement was mutually understood. Elena faltered, uncertain. A motel is the logical option. My funds are sufficient for 2 nights to formulate a plan. And subsequently, he probed. That, she conceded, remains a total cognitive void. Her smile was a facial mask, failing to reflect any internal affect. I have existed within another's narrative for so long I've lost my own parameters. Dominic maintained his silence, his gray gaze fixed. He produced a card from his jacket and propelled it across the smooth surface. If you require any form of assistance, he offered quietly. Employment, lodging, legal representation, anything. Utilize this number at any hour. Elena examined the card. Its design was minimalist, containing only a name and a sequence of digits. No corporate affiliation, no title, no context. What is the motive for this benevolence? She questioned. You have no data on me. I observed the relevant data, Dominic countered. I observe your fear, your isolation, and that you have earned a superior reality to the one you escaped. And I recognize that the sole barrier to a new life is often a single point of entry. Elena's focus shifted from the simple white card to his face. A nonverbal exchange occurred between them, a sense of familiarity incongruous with a chance meeting in a storm-lashed establishment. Thank you, she stated, the expression feeling inadequate for the offering. Dominic rose, fastening the one button on his coat. No gratitude is required. Simply affirm that you will make contact if necessary. I will. His gaze met hers, and within that silent interval, Elena perceived a foundational shift. It was not romantic attachment, not yet, but the nascent stage of a significant dynamic. A tacit agreement, perhaps, or the convergence of 2 subjects whose life trajectories were always directed toward this intersection. With a slight nod, Dominic turned and was absorbed into the Chicago night. Elena remained alone, the card a tangible, cold object in her palm. She was completely unaware that Dominic Romano was a primary power broker within the city. She did not know his name functioned as currency in secure environments, that his influence permeated the city's substructure, or that he served as a final arbiter when legal systems failed. She could not comprehend that by accepting his card, she had initiated an irreversible alteration of her life's course. Her only cognition was that after 8 years, her state of acute disorientation had ceased, and for that interval it was sufficient. Elena exited Nocturne into the cold November atmosphere. The precipitation had ended, rendering the streets reflective under the urban lights, suggesting a fresh and promising state. She inhaled for stabilization and proceeded toward the nearest hotel. Across the street, concealed by shadows, a black sedan remained stationary, its engine a low hum. From within, an operative with a scarred visage observed Elena until she was no longer in his line of sight. He then raised a phone to his ear. "Asset is in motion," he reported, requesting instructions on a tail. A pause followed on the line. Then Dominic Romano's voice emerged, composed and authoritative. "Negative. Cease observation. Redirect surveillance to the husband. I require a complete dossier on Marcus Whitfield on my desk by sunrise." A faint smile formed on the operative's lips. "Boss, are you certain of this course? Entanglement with a transient subject presents risks." "She is no longer a transient," Dominic's voice retorted, sharp as fractured glass. The connection terminated, and the vehicle merged back into the city's circulatory system. Elena remained oblivious to the complex network she had entered. Yet one fact was absolute. Her life had been fundamentally rerouted. It is a clinical note to remain observant. To disregard this is to miss the narratives that persist beyond the final analysis. Do not allow the next phase to commence without your observation. The hotel room was a sterile environment, a generic double unit 3 blocks from the lake. The decor consisted of beige walls, a brown floor, and nondescript mass-market art typical of such establishments. To Elena, however, it functioned as a sanctuary. On the initial night, she remained supine, her cognitive state too agitated for sleep, anticipating an imminent breach of the room by Marcus. The calls began around 0200 hours, 37 in total, before she deactivated the device. His text messages displayed the predictable progression of a personality losing control over a perceived possession. The communications devolved from feigned concern to rage, culminating in threats. "Where are you? This is not a game, Elena. Respond or face consequences. You are nothing without me. Fine, I apologize. Return home." "Very well. Have it your way. You will soon learn the outcome of abandoning me." Elena analyzed each message with the clinical detachment of a third-party observer. She now identified them not as communications, but as instruments of psychological manipulation intended to erode her will. She provided no response. 48 hours later, she is seated on the bed's edge, holding Dominic's card, assessing her limited options. $400 of her escape funds had been expended on lodging, sustenance, and a disposable phone to prevent tracking by Marcus. At the current rate of expenditure, her resources would last 1 more week, possibly 2, with extreme rationing. Beyond that point lay an unknown outcome. She lacked employment, a social support network for 3 years, a permanent address, a vehicle, and any personal financial history. Marcus had systematically deconstructed her autonomy. She had once misinterpreted his control as care. She now recognized it as the architecture of a prison. Elena's focus returned to the card. Dominic Romano. It was a name, but the subject had made a significant impression. The intensity of his focus, his active listening, his unconditional offer of aid. She took the new device and keyed in the numbers. After 2 rings, a professional, dispassionate voice answered. "Romano Enterprises, how may I direct your call?" Elena's respiration paused. "I require communication with Dominic. Dominic Romano. He supplied me with this number." "May I have your name?" the voice inquired. Elena Martinez. It is possible he will not recall." One moment. A click, then profound silence. Elena's heart rate accelerated as she waited, gripped by the anxiety that this was a severe error in judgment and that he never anticipated her actually using the contact information. Then his voice, low and familiar, transmitted through the device. "Elena, I was anticipating your call." A wave of relief washed over her, potent enough to cause momentary vertigo. "You remember me?" Affirmative. His tone was calming but contained an undercurrent of concern. "Are you unharmed? Is your location secure?" "I'm in a hotel. I terminated contact with Marcus that night. I did not return." "Correct. A sound decision." A meaningful pause occupied the space. "Have you had nutritional intake today?" The inquiry was so unexpectedly mundane, it penetrated her anxiety. "What?" "Sustenance. Have you eaten?" She could not recall. Perhaps a portion of a sandwich the previous day. Coffee. "I'm fine." That is not a direct answer. She could visualize his expression of disapproval. "What is your current location?" She provided the hotel's name, and the subsequent silence was filled with unstated analysis. "A vehicle is en route," Dominic declared. "It will arrive in 20 minutes. I require you to enter it and be transported to a secure facility." "Secure?" "More secure than your current position. Marcus Whitfield possesses resources, Elena. A hotel registered in your name is his primary search vector." A chilling apprehension permeated Elena's system. The lapse in operational security was catastrophic. She had used her legal name and personal credit card for the room, creating a clear digital trail leading directly to her. "How do you possess intelligence on Marcus's capabilities?" she asked. The silence that ensued was vast. "Let us say my profession involves understanding men of influence. It is my business to be aware of such things. Get in the car, Elena. Your questions will be addressed upon arrival." The connection was severed. Elena stared at the phone, her thoughts in turmoil. Every self-preservation instinct indicated a critical error that entering an unknown vehicle bound for an undisclosed location was the prelude to a negative outcome. However, a deeper cognitive process, one holding some memory of his gaze and the profound experience of being accurately perceived, maintained trust in Dominic Romano. It was a belief that defied logical assessment. She collected her few belongings and descended to the lobby. The car arrived in exactly 20 minutes, a pristine black sedan with windows rendered opaque by tinting. The chauffeur, a middle-aged functionary, operated with a textbook silent competence. He opened her door without a word. "What is our objective?" she inquired, verbalizing her loss of agency as she settled into the leather seat. "The Romano compound, madam. The transit will last approximately 40 minutes." The car integrated into the traffic flow like a phantom. Elena observed the city's deconstruction into a blur of light, a sensory confirmation of her displacement to the affluent North Shore. The residences escalated from mansions to citadels, protected by high walls and wrought iron barriers, their lawns manicured with an obsessive precision. Eventually, the sedan pivoted onto a private road, halting before an immense stone gate. The driver spoke a quiet code into a console, and the gates receded with a silent, weightless grace. Their vehicle ascended a serpentine road, flanked by the enormous, gnarled frameworks of ancient oak trees, before the main structure became visible. It was not a home. It was a secure facility. A 3-story architectural feat of gray stone and sheer glass, it stood like a monument to severe modernism, its windows like vertical blades aimed at the sky, observing a lawn that swept down to a private lake. The sensation was one of controlled force, a chilling minimalism that was the clinical antithesis of the garish excess Marcus preferred. This place did not broadcast its wealth. Its affluence was a fundamental ambient state. As the car stopped, a young man in a dark suit opened Elena's door. He was in his late 20s with a defined face and a gaze that processed too much information. "Mrs. Martinez, I am Vincent. Mr. Romano requested I bring you inside." Elena was escorted into a foyer of staggering proportions. Its ceiling soared 2 stories high, and from it hung a chaotic, abstract sculpture resembling a captured bolt of lightning. The floors were polished concrete, and the walls held art that, while she did not know it, resonated with incalculable value. "This way." Vincent led her through a sequence of rooms, each grander than the last. A great room focused on a hearth a person could enter, a library with shelves that seemed to recede into darkness, and a dining room with a table that could accommodate 20. Their progression ended at glass doors that slid open to a terrace cantilevered over the lake. He was present. Dominic. He stood with his hands in his pockets, analyzing the water's slate-gray surface. He turned at her arrival, his face displaying a complex emotional state. Not simply relief, but a clear element of triumph, and something else too deep for her to classify. "You complied," he stated, not as an inquiry. "I sent the vehicle, but I was unsure if you would submit." Elena crossed her arms, a sudden subject in this environment of quiet, total control. "I almost did not. But I recalled your warning about Marcus, that he could locate me." Dominic gave a slow, calculated nod. "He has already initiated his response. A missing persons file was opened under your name this morning." "What?" "He is fabricating a narrative that you suffered a mental collapse and disappeared. He is performing the role of the distraught husband." The contempt in Dominic's voice was a sharp instrument. "He is a convincing performer, and the authorities have accepted his script." Vertigo overcame Elena. It was his signature maneuver to manipulate the environment until she was the hysteric and he was the victim. It was a pattern of behavior he had perfected over the course of their marriage. "I'm not sick," she stated. "I'm not having a breakdown. I terminated the relationship." "I'm aware, but the police are not, and his legal team certainly will not be. If they find you before your narrative is established, he can have you committed, or at the very least, make your existence impossible." The accuracy of his words landed with the weight of a physical blow. Marcus was not just searching for her. He was systematically erasing her identity, poisoning her credibility until any words she uttered would be dismissed as psychosis. "What can I do?" Elena asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Dominic turned to her, his gray eyes containing a solemn fire. "You permit me to intervene. You remain here, in this sanctuary. You work with my legal assets to build a case for your autonomy that Marcus cannot breach. And you will learn to trust my assertion that when this is over, Marcus Whitfield will no longer be a factor in your life." The promise was immense, a declaration of impossible scope. Elena's thoughts were spiraling, a primal survival mechanism screaming that she could not trust this individual she had just encountered. "Why?" The word escaped her. "What is your motive for offering this?" Dominic was silent for a long interval, his intense gaze locked with hers, making it impossible to disengage. "Because I have observed what men like Marcus do to the people they claim to possess," he said at last. "Because I watched it fracture someone I loved, and I swore I would never again remain a bystander when I had the means to act." He paused. "And because you entered that cafe appearing as if life had ground you to powder, but I could still see the oppositional instinct in your eyes. That is significant." Elena was speechless. No one had ever addressed her with such direct conviction. The experience was as terrifying as it was cathartic. "All right," she heard herself say. "I will stay, provisionally." Dominic tilted his head. the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. "Good. Vincent will escort you to your accommodations. Rest, Elena. Tomorrow we begin the counteroffensive." He walked past her toward the house, leaving her isolated on the terrace, staring at the lake. The water was dark and still, a perfect mirror of the bruised November sky. A bird's cry, lonely and mournful, carried across the surface. She re-examined the blur of the past 3 days. Fleeing Marcus's function, the meeting with Dominic, the sterile hotel, the black sedan, and now this, existing in the stronghold of a near stranger who identified a power in her that her husband had tried to eradicate. It felt like the onset of something high risk, something crucial, something that could restructure her entire reality. Elena took a deep breath and followed Vincent back into the compound. 3 weeks passed in a strange new rhythm. Elena discovered a peculiar routine in Dominic's fortress, but she remained far from stable. Nothing about her life was settled. Every morning, she awoke in an expansive guest suite with a view of the lake, and for a second was disoriented, unsure of her location. Then the chilling reality of her predicament would return, and she would force herself out of bed to engage with another day. The home was operated by a silent team of personnel she was slowly learning to identify. There was Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, a formidable woman in her 60s who managed the estate with unspoken complete authority. There was Carlos, the chef, a warm man from Mexico who insisted she have 3 meals a day, despite her appetite. And there was Vincent, who functioned as Dominic's shadow and sentinel, constantly present yet never intrusive. And then there was Dominic, who was often absent for business he never elaborated on. On the days he was on site, they would share meals, falling into extended conversations that ranged from art to the narratives of their lives. Elena learned of his youth in South Chicago, of immigrant parents who had pushed themselves to the breaking point for their children. She learned his father died when he was 16, forcing him to set aside his own future to provide for his family, ultimately forging an empire with raw, brutal focus. The one detail he never specified was what precisely that empire was founded on. But Elena was not delusional. She observed the men who arrived at all hours, their voices low, their respect for Dominic tinged with a very tangible fear. She overheard fragments of conversation about shipments, territories, and problems that had to be managed. She saw how Vincent's hand would drift to his side, as if reaching for a weapon that was not visible. The reality of what Dominic did for a living solidified in her mind, hardening from a hypothesis into a certainty. But paradoxically, she felt no fear. Any rational woman would have escaped this beautiful enclosure, fleeing the man and the violence that was a part of his nature. But for 8 years, Elena had already been subjected to a different sort of violence. The covert kind that wears a $1,000 suit and corrodes a person's soul. By comparison, Dominic's dark world felt almost candid. With him, at least, the predator did not pretend to be something else. Marcus had spent their entire marriage performing a humanity he never possessed. The legal proceeding dragged on, a slow, grinding process of attrition. Dominic's counsel, a team of aggressive, well-dressed predators, systematically dismantled Marcus's financial structure. They had exhumed his hidden wrongdoings, the concealed wealth, the criminal enterprises, the falsified documents. Most devastatingly, they wove a narrative from years of his concealed cruelty, constructing a wall of evidence his charisma could not overcome. Marcus characteristically refused to capitulate. His report of a missing wife was neutralized by Elena's testimony, forcing him to change his approach. He froze their mutual assets, restricting her financial autonomy. He fought every filing, disputed every judgment in a war of 1,000 paper cuts. To the public, he was the aggrieved spouse, the abandoned victim. Elena could only endure the storm of public perception from her gilded prison. It was in this limbo, on a bleak December Tuesday, that Dominic's estate revealed a secret which changed everything. She had started mapping the estate's layout when the quiet became too oppressive. The mansion was its own hermetic universe, constantly revealing another corridor, a new chamber, a door that would not yield. That afternoon, her exploration took her to the West Wing, a section she had not yet penetrated. The hallway was still, bordered by anonymous, closed doors. At the corridor's conclusion, a single door was partially open. A blade of light cut through the dimness, drawing her toward it. Every instinct transmitted a warning, but the pull of the unknown had always been her critical vulnerability. She pushed the door inward and crossed the threshold. The subject observed a space that was incongruously a juvenile sanctuary. Luxurious, yet designed for a young female, the chamber featured blush-toned walls, miniature furniture, and a silent assembly of plush objects. The area was layered with drawings and paintings. There on the floor, a small girl remained wholly absorbed within her sketchbook. Her focus broke as Elena entered the room, revealing exceptionally large, dark eyes. The child was approximately 7 or 8 years of age, with hair arranged in 2 small bunches, and a face that was an unsettling facsimile of a man Elena knew. His eyes, his jawline, his intense concentration. She was a miniature replica of Dominic. "Who are you?" The child's inquiry was sharp and articulate. Elena's cognition fragmented as she processed the revelation. His offspring. "My name is Elena," she stated, lowering herself to the child's level. "I am a guest. And your name?" "Sophia." The girl's gaze exerted a palpable pressure, unnervingly direct. "Are you my father's new partner?" The question induced a sudden vasomotor response across Elena's skin. Sophia's reply was a rehearsed catechism, a litany concerning her father's occupation. With deliberate finality, she re-engaged with her drawing, the one domain where she exercised full control, before extending an offer. "I am rendering the lake. Do you wish to see it?" The drawing presented a remarkable window into a juvenile psyche, a landscape rendered with profound grief. Stark trees reached for a heavy sky above water, the color of slate. When Elena commended the work, Sophia delivered a clinical assessment. "Art is the mechanism I use to correct the sadness." It neutralizes the discomfort. Elena's reflexive query, "What causes your sadness?" was met with a small, fatalistic shrug. "My mother vanished," she stated, the information delivered as fact. "A long time ago. She is now only a memory." The statement activated a resonant trauma deep within Elena. It was a distress familiar from her mother's death, and again from the dissolution of her marriage. "I recognize that specific absence," Elena whispered. The girl's eyes narrowed, assessing her. "Is your mother also gone?" "Yes, for many years." That is a significant source of sorrow. Sophia processed this, then articulated a truth of devastating weight. "But you possessed her initially. That is not a universal experience." The child's raw insight registered as a psychic blow, leaving Elena stunned by a sorrow that had clearly reshaped a childhood into something else. "Sophia!" Dominic's voice was a low-frequency warning from the doorway. Both subjects started, turning to see him there, his expression a carefully maintained, neutral mask. "Daddy!" Sophia became a projectile, her small form colliding with his legs before he lifted her into his arms. "Why are you awake, little mouse?" he asked, his vocal tone shifting to a register Elena had not previously observed. Mrs. Chen believed you were asleep. I lacked somnolence. Then Elena arrived. Sophia smiled at her. She is agreeable, Daddy. May she remain? His gaze locked with Elena's over the child's head. A silent, high-stakes negotiation occurred in his eyes, a syntax she was unable to parse. We will evaluate the possibility, he stated at last. Now go to Mrs. Chen. I require a private discussion with Elena. Sophia complied, disengaging from his hold with a small wave before departing. The ensuing silence was dense with subtext. You have a child, Elena verbalized, the words functioning as an indictment. And you keep her in isolation. Dominic moved toward one of Sophia's artworks. It is the method by which I ensure her safety. For her sake? Every action I take is for her, he affirmed, turning to meet her eyes. The world I operate in is not structured for children, Elena. There are individuals who would view her as a point of leverage. Her concealment is the only protection I can offer. The statement added a new dimension to his psychological profile. Predator, guardian, and father. The contradictions of his character were severe. Her mother? Elena inquired softly, lost to cancer when Sophia was 3. The clinical phrasing had a heavy impact. I have raised her since, with assistance naturally, but in every manner that is meaningful. I have been alone. I am very sorry. Do not be. That period is concluded. His eyes, however, suggested narratives of unresolved trauma. Certain wounds are not meant to be resolved, but to be managed. She is exceptional, Elena observed. Sophia, her perception of the world, it is uncommon. A fissure appeared in Dominic's formidable composure. She is the only positive thing I have ever produced, he said. All of this, the enterprise, the wealth, the power, is meaningless by comparison. Elena registered the absolute certainty in his voice. In that moment, his archetype was recontextualized. Not merely the head of a violent syndicate, but a father engaged in a desperate struggle to construct a secure environment for his offspring. It was a primal motivation she understood viscerally. Might I interact with her on occasion? Elena proposed. During my time here, I believe we could be mutually beneficial. Dominic evaluated the request during a prolonged silence. Finally, he offered a slow, measured nod. She would benefit from a friend, he conceded. One who is not on my payroll, one who perceives a child, not a vulnerability, someone who simply perceives her. I am capable of that. I am aware. A tacit agreement was established between them, an understanding that transcended verbal communication. That is the reason I am consenting. Subsequently, Elena and Sophia formed a durable alliance constructed from shared confidences and juvenile play. Mrs. Chen observed, with the mask of disapproval, while privately documenting their developing rapport. Sophia revealed her imagined worlds, and Elena provided narratives from the hospital. Gradually, imperceptibly, the ambient emotional climate of the residence began to shift. The atmosphere became less oppressive, marked by the sound of a child's laughter, long suppressed. Even Dominic, a man defined by his violent persona, seemed to alter. He exhibited less rigidity, more humanity. Then one evening, Sophia's small hand reached out and secured Elena's with a firm grip. Elena, I am here. Will you reside with us, permanently? The question functioned as an emotional catalyst for Elena. She possessed no answer. Her past was a conflict zone, her future an uncharted territory. The concept of forever seemed absurd. Still, she met Sophia's pleading gaze. I will remain for as long as I am capable, she vowed. Whatever transpires next, I will be your friend, consistently. Sophia's features relaxed into a smile. A promise. Then she succumbed to sleep. Observing the child's powerful conviction, Elena felt a profound internal realignment. The emotion she held for Sophia was beyond affection. It was a potent maternal impulse emerging from a long dormancy. She was so absorbed at the moment she failed to detect Dominic's silent approach. "She has formed a strong attachment to you," he stated quietly. His voice from the doorway was a current that passed through her. "The sentiment is fully reciprocated," she admitted. "I did not anticipate this." He advanced into the room, his focus fixed on his daughter. The low light mitigated the harsh angles of his face, his psychological defenses momentarily lowered. "She has not bonded with anyone this intensely since her mother died," he confessed. "I was concerned she had lost the capacity." "She merely needed someone to perceive her," Elena replied. "To truly see her, not as a managed asset, but simply as Sophia." His gaze met hers, and the space between them became electrically charged. His presence was a tangible warmth. "She required someone like you," he said, his voice low. "Someone like me," she repeated. The atmosphere grew dense, resonating with a force they had both systematically repressed. A strong, insistent rhythm began in Elena's circulatory system, evidence of a powerful attraction between them. One can hypothesize the sudden hemodynamic response, the shared, suspended breath in Elena's moment of realization. The narrative relies on a belief in improbable interpersonal forces. The silence between them became a high-voltage conduit, vibrating with unspoken potential and the threat of an electrical arc. But Dominic retreated one step, breaking the connection. "You require sleep," he said, his vocal tone now coarse. "Tomorrow will be a demanding day." He turned and departed, leaving Elena with physiological tremors in the aftermath. A significant boundary had been breached with no possibility of regression. For the first time in an extended period, Elena exhibited no anxiety about proximate outcomes. Christmas manifested at the Romano estate, an unscheduled yet accepted incursion of ritual and illumination. Her presence was a byproduct of her own arrested life, her divorce entangled in Marcus's matrix of spite. Her legal counsel assured an eventual positive outcome. It was simply a matter of tolerance. Yet time within a confined state becomes a unique form of psychological duress. And so she found herself observing the holiday with a dangerous man she was attracted to, a child she had bonded with, and armed personnel who felt increasingly familiar. Mrs. Chen's precise work had converted the estate into a display of winter lighting and evergreen, with a 12-foot pine dominating the main hall. The meal produced by Carlos was a complex array of flavors, his family's tamales coexisting with traditional holiday fare in a seamless fusion of cultures. Sophia's persistence resulted in the typically inflexible Vincent consenting to wear a Santa hat. Dominic's transformation, however, was more substantive. He suspended his clandestine enterprises, devoting himself completely to his daughter's sphere with a focus Elena had not previously witnessed. The chronic tension that characterized his posture seemed to dissipate, replaced by an aura of ease, an almost joyful demeanor. On Christmas morning, the room's singular focus was Sophia's uninhibited delight as she discovered an art set, a collection of books, and a dress Elena had covertly helped him choose. But a small locket containing a miniature portrait of her mother elicited an acute emotional response. "It was in storage," Dominic stated, his voice thick with unexpressed history. "I felt you should possess this." Sophia encircled him with her arms in a silent, meaningful embrace that required no words. "I have an object for you," he murmured later, sliding a small box toward Elena across the table. A gift was a completely unexpected variable. She viewed herself as an external agent, a transient figure. "Proceed, open it," Sophia encouraged, her own anticipation palpable. Inside the velvet was a fine gold bracelet featuring a solitary butterfly motif. "For a new beginning," Dominic stated softly, "and for the will to escape." His words registered as a profound internal stimulus for the subject. Within the paradoxical safety of this fortified environment, she experienced the resurgence of a defunct emotion: hope. "My gratitude," she replied. "It is exquisite." The object's weight signified a covenant, a stark contrast to a restraint. The day's events resolved into a communal ritual she had considered an artifact of a former life. Observing Dominic's unguarded affect triggered a response she had not yet classified. Considerably later, after Sophia's sleep cycle, Elena located Dominic on the terrace. Shielded from the accumulating snow, she attempted to articulate her sense of obligation for the day, the sanctuary, and the totality of his provisions. Dominic's gaze remained fixed on the bleak winter landscape. He observed the snow falling toward the dark water. "You are not a guest here, Elena," he asserted. "This is your residence. Whether you perceive it yet or not, you are an integrated part of this unit." "Dominic." "I am aware," he interjected, his focus finally shifting to her, his features open and unguarded. "I acknowledge the profound irrationality of this situation. You remain legally bound to another man, engaged in a survival conflict while forging an identity free of Marcus Whitfield's influence, and I am the antithesis of a secure harbor." "I am not seeking security," Elena countered, surprised by her own conviction. "I have experienced a simple existence. Simplicity was the performance of happiness, while my husband systematically deconstructed me. Simplicity was the pleasant facade that masked structural fractures and silent trauma." She inhaled. "What I require," she declared, "is authenticity. I require truth, regardless of its complexity. I require an individual who perceives my entire psychological state, the damaged components, the recovering elements, and all the interstitial spaces." Her gaze met his in a moment of unfiltered disclosure. "I choose you." The declaration hung between them, absolute in the cold air. With deliberate motion, he reached out, interlacing his fingers with hers. "And you," he confessed. "From the moment you entered that diner, saturated and defiant, I misdiagnosed the impulse as a savior complex, but its etiology was never that simple. The motivation was always more significant. What is our subsequent protocol? We await your complete liberation." He brought her hand to his lips. "I refuse to become another instrument for his pathology. Our movements must be deliberate. And once you are finally severed from him—" An atypical, genuine smile manifested on Dominic's face. "At that point, I will dedicate my existence to validating your decision." Elena leaned into him, and for hours they observed the snowfall, projecting a future that seemed proximate. January arrived with a blizzard, initiated by a nocturnal communication and a barrage of terse, urgent Italian from Dominic. Observing from his study's threshold, Elena interpreted the danger not from the dialect, but from the unyielding rigidity of his posture. He terminated the call, his complexion ashen. "What has occurred?" she inquired. "Marcus." He spoke the name like a pathogen. "He conducted surveillance, he found you, he has contracted agents for your retrieval." A visceral fear response constricted in Elena's gut. "What is their profile?" "They are operatives who do not process refusal." Dominic activated a concealed control on his desk. Vincent appeared at the doorway, his posture immediately on alert. "We have a situation," Dominic stated. "Activate the unit. This estate is to be locked down. Double patrol frequency and maintain continuous perimeter surveillance 24/7. All ingress and egress is prohibited without my express authorization." Vincent gave a curt nod and vanished. Elena collapsed into a chair, her cognitions accelerating. How did he locate me? Marcus possesses resources. Dominic's tone was grim. More extensive than my assessment. His compulsion to own you is more pathological than I understood. What is our strategy? He knelt before her, his hands enveloping hers. We will retaliate, he vowed, leveraging every asset available, legal and otherwise. We are going to condition Marcus Whitfield in absolute terms that you are not his property. And if that contingency fails, then I will terminate the conflict by my own methods. That absolute conviction in his voice should have been a catalyst for fear. Instead, a profound sense of security enveloped her, a response to a protector figure willing to incinerate the world for her. My trust is in you, she breathed. That is understood. He kissed her forehead. Initiate a rest cycle. The engagement begins tomorrow. But sleep was physiologically unattainable. Elena remained hypervigilant, the quiet punctuated by the auditory cues of a fortress preparing for an assault. Muffled movements, low-frequency commands, the faint, metallic sounds of weapon mechanisms. Intrusive cognitions of Marcus surfaced. The man she married, the predator he became. A grief response for the years consumed by fear overwhelmed her. She contemplated the scenario of being forcibly returned to him, and a firm resolve solidified within her. Mortality was preferable to re-entering that cage. The ideation held no terror, only agency. She rose, donned a robe, and proceeded to Dominic's location. He was positioned in the study, a central commander among men in dark suits. Maps were displayed on his desk like strategic charts. Devices hummed with incoming intelligence. He disengaged from his team upon perceiving her. You should be resting, he said gently. I cannot. I am the catalyst for this. This event is not attributable to you. The agent is Marcus, a deviant, controlling personality who refuses to process loss. Dominic framed her face with his hands. His pathology is not your burden, Elena. It never was. I must have a function, she insisted. I cannot remain passive while this unfolds. Allow me to assist. Dominic held her gaze for a long, calculating interval before offering a slow, deliberate nod. Agreed, he conceded. I know your exact application. The resulting strategy was both simple and brutal. Marcus's team had been conducting reconnaissance for days, probing for a weakness, wholly unaware they were the subjects of observation. We will manipulate them to believe they have identified a lapse in our security, Dominic briefed his core unit. We will bait them toward a window that appears to be an oversight, but is a prepared snare. The moment they commit, we initiate the countermeasure. The evidence we secure will be irrefutable. And what is my function? Elena asked. You are the lure. The statement settled in the room, chilling and absolute. Before you object, Dominic added quickly, you will not be in physical jeopardy. Vincent and 3 of my top operatives will be with you, unseen. The second they act, we will collapse on them. The risk to your person is 0. But for the trap to be successful, they must believe victory is probable, Elena verbalized. They require full commitment before you engage. Precisely. Elena considered the parameters. The woman she had been would have fractured. That psychological profile was gone. She had been the target for years. Now she was a component of the trap. "I will do it," she stated, her voice devoid of uncertainty. It required 3 days to prepare the environment. Elena adhered to her daily routine, a convincing performance of obliviousness for any observers. She was the picture of untroubled composure. Beneath her serene facade, Dominic's unit moved like silent hunters. Covert cameras, listening devices, and armed personnel occupied strategic positions. It was a sophisticated and unnerving surveillance network. On the evening of the 3rd day, the trap was triggered. Elena was reading in the library when she registered the distant sound of shattering glass. Her heart rate accelerated, yet she maintained perfect stillness, her eyes fixed on the text. A flawless depiction of non-awareness. She detected approaching footsteps. The library door was thrown open. 2 figures in black entered, faces masked, their motions precise and economical. A voice from her past, flat and effectless, stated, "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband has requested your return." Elena's reply was a quiet assertion of her new identity. "My name is Martinez, and I am not departing." The men exchanged a look. One produced a syringe as a nonverbal ultimatum. Before she could respond, the room erupted into action. Vincent emerged from a concealed panel, a nexus of efficient force. Simultaneously, Dominic's men breached the windows, flooding the room. The hostiles were neutralized with a celerity that precluded their comprehension of the ambush. The engagement concluded in less than 30 seconds. Dominic appeared at the threshold, his expression a mask of ice and rage. "Transport them to the warehouse," he commanded. "I require a complete debriefing. Their employer, their methods, their exact orders." As the subjects were removed, Dominic and Elena remained in the shattered space, a heavy silence present. "Are you injured?" he asked, his tone softening. "I am fine." The violent episode had passed, leaving a residual tremor audible in her voice. "That was significant. I know. I regret your exposure to that." "Don't!" Her gaze met his, a fragile smile appearing amid the destruction. "I pledged my assistance. This constitutes that assistance." He drew her close, his embrace a buffer against the fear. His words were a low murmur against her hair. "The end is imminent. One final stage, and Marcus will be a ghost in your history." "Are you certain?" "Our guests are about to engage in a very persuasive interview with my people, and an asset in the DA's office has awaited an opportunity to dismantle Marcus Whitfield's world for years." Dominic pulled back, his hands on her shoulders, his gray eyes burning with conviction. "By the following week, your husband will be submerged in indictments of conspiracy and kidnapping. His entire enterprise is imploding, and the process is irreversible." Elena fixated on his words with a desperate, tangible need. Subject, Elena, expressed residual anxiety, a common symptom of prolonged abuse, positing, "What if his legal team fabricates a defense?" His response was absolute, a textbook display of dominance. "That is not a possibility." What ensued was a systematic application of legal and extra-legal pressure, engineered to ensure subject Marcus's containment. His subordinates, when subjected to interrogation, displayed predictable loyalty failure, identifying Marcus as the primary instigator. The accumulation of evidence created an irrefutable legal narrative. The subject's apprehension was a public spectacle, a symbolic inversion of the power dynamic he previously exploited. The subject's disgrace was broadcast repeatedly, a media-driven ritual of degradation. From a secure environment, Elena observed, processing the nascent sensation of psychological liberation. The subsequent legal termination of her marriage solidified this transition, presenting her with an unstructured future. He positioned himself at the exit, a symbolic guardian. "Describe your affective state." Her response after a period of reflection was telling. "A reintegration of self," she stated. "My core identity felt suspended, awaiting this specific trigger for reactivation." His smile, a rare positive stimulus, altered the emotional atmosphere. "Excellent," he responded. "I must present a proposition." He initiated physical contact, a tactile gesture of intimacy. "Cohabitate with me, not as a subject seeking asylum, but as an equal partner whom I value." Her respiration pattern indicated a psychosomatic response to his disclosure. "Your affection is genuine?" "It was established at our initial point of contact," Dominic clarified. "I postponed this declaration pending conflict resolution." She processed his persona, dominant, lethal, yet a provider of unconditional security. She projected a potential future dyad, acknowledging its inherent dichotomies of struggle and success. The affirmative response was precognitive. "Yes," she articulated. "I will accept your offer." His subsequent physical embrace was characterized by high intensity. For her, it was a sensory confirmation of freedom. 6 months later, a significant environmental shift was observed. The once austere landscape, a fortress, now presented as a thriving ecosystem. This botanical regeneration serves as a powerful metaphor for the subject's psychological convalescence and triumph. From the terrace, Elena absorbed the vista, a clear indicator of environmental integration. Her attire signaled a state of psychological ease. The minor Sophia exhibited heightened psychomotor activity. "Do you feel anxiety?" the child inquired softly. A subtle smile registered on Elena's face. "Minimal levels. And you?" "Negative." "This has been my primary objective," Sophia replied. "The designation of you as my maternal figure is still difficult to process." This specific term produced a strong emotional response in Elena. The bond with Sophia, however, had repaired a psychic lesion of which Elena was previously unaware. The legal formalization of the adoption confirmed her new maternal role. Soon she would add the spousal role. The commitment ceremony was a contained event, limited to their primary social network. One attendee displayed a strong emotional response. Carlos and Vincent assumed positions of support beside Dominic. His professional associates were also present. Elena's solo procession was a deliberate act, rejecting the notion of being transferred as property. She cognitively reviewed her history of being treated as a commodity. This event was a deviation, an autonomous decision based on her established identity. Dominic's fixed gaze was a powerful attentional focus. She perceived the emotional state beneath his authoritative presentation. Upon her arrival, the ritual commenced. Their vows were self-authored, reflecting their shared history of conflict. "I pledge to perceive your authentic self," Elena began, "not the persona, but the individual who intercepted my life's path that evening." Dominic reciprocated. "I will function as your shield, not your enclosure. I am your ally." He pledged unconditional allegiance. They performed the ritual of exchanging rings, finalizing the bond with a kiss. A vocal affirmation from the assembled group followed. The subsequent gathering was a vibrant social event. Elena engaged in ritualized social interactions, though she did not process all narratives. Her gaze repeatedly sought Dominic's, establishing a continuous nonverbal communication link. As the event's intensity waned, Elena sought the tactile and thermal sensation of the lake. She registered his approach through auditory cues alone. He initiated physical contact from behind. "Are you absconding?" he inquired with levity. Her reply was absolute. Never. She accepted his embrace, verbalizing her cognitive process, recalling. The subject, he inquired. My previous psychological state, she clarified, fragmented, fearful, and disoriented. She then reoriented to face him, versus my current state. Define it, he prompted. I am home, she smiled. Sanctuary achieved, Dominic affirmed, before a sequence of kisses, murmuring, Welcome home, Mrs. Romano. We observed two individuals with histories of trauma, now engaged in constructing a shared future from past damage. The lake served as a perfect reflecting surface. Their daughter, Sophia, observed them from a window, her expression indicative of profound calm. In the distance, the metropolis represented a duality of violent conclusions and new beginnings. Elena contemplated the circuitous path that led to her present circumstances. Her recollection included the chronic trauma, the acute escape event, and the pivotal encounter. A cognitive assessment of alternative negative outcomes produced a deep feeling of gratitude for her own resilience, the environment for recovery, and her new surrogate family unit. Not all trauma narratives conclude in tragedy. This case demonstrates a successful defiance of initial prognostications. For these who have followed this analysis, your sustained attention is noted. Indicate your engagement by commenting, Analysis observed. Your presence is valued. My purpose is the dissection of such complex psychological case files for your edification. Ensure you are subscribed for future analyses, which will examine individuals who defied psychological breaking points and demonstrated significant resistance. To participate in our next analysis of the human psyche, subscribe and activate notifications. A final clinical observation. No trauma is so profound that recovery is impossible. This case is more than a narrative. It is a diagnostic map. And our study. Bell,